Lisa had always loved hunting for antiques, drawn to the mystery of forgotten objects. On a quiet Sunday morning, she wandered into an unfamiliar neighborhood and stumbled upon a strange yard sale. The place felt oddly abandoned, yet an old man sat behind a rickety table, watching her with hollow eyes. Dust-covered trinkets and faded furniture lay scattered, but one object caught Lisa's attention, a beautifully carved music box. As she reached for it, the old man's voice broke the silence. "Do not open it after midnight." His warning sent a chill down her spine, but curiosity overpowered caution. Lisa placed the ornate music box on her living room shelf, admiring its intricate design. The dark mahogany wood was carved with delicate floral patterns, and its golden inlays shimmered under the dim light. There was no key to wind it, yet something about it felt strangely alive. She could not shake the old man's warning from her mind. "Do not open it after midnight." It was an odd thing to say, but surely it was just an attempt to add mystery to an already intriguing object. Later that evening, Lisa went about her routine. She made herself a cup of tea, curled up with a book, and let the stress of the day fade away. The music box sat untouched on the shelf, but every so often her eyes flicked toward it. A nagging curiosity gnawed at her thoughts. Why had the old man been so insistent? What would really happen if she opened it? By the time she got ready for bed, she had nearly forgotten about the music box. She switched off the lights and crawled under the covers, exhaustion pulling her into a dreamless sleep. But just as she was drifting off, a soft sound echoed through the silent room. A melody. Lisa's eyes snapped open. The music was faint, almost imperceptible, yet undeniably there. Her heart pounded as she sat up, scanning the darkened room. The sound was coming from the shelf. The music box was playing, on its own. She hesitated before getting up, her bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. Slowly she approached the shelf. The box remained closed, its lid tightly shut. Yet the eerie tune continued, delicate and haunting. A shiver ran down her spine. Lisa reached out, her fingers brushing against the smooth wood. The moment she touched it, the music stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was heavier than before, as if the air itself had thickened. She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "It is just my imagination," she whispered to herself. Maybe the box had some kind of old, hidden mechanism, something that reacted to movement. She convinced herself it was nothing more than a strange but explainable phenomenon. Still, an uneasy feeling settled in her stomach as she returned to bed. She left the lamp on that night, unable to shake the sense that something unseen was watching her. The next morning, Lisa woke up to something even stranger. The music box was no longer on the shelf. It was sitting on her bedside table. Her breath caught in her throat. Had she moved it in her sleep? That was impossible. She had not even touched it after last night's bizarre event. A sinking dread filled her chest as she stared at the box, now seemingly closer to her than before. Somewhere deep inside her, she knew this was not just an ordinary antique. This was not a treasure. This was something else entirely. Over the next few days, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The music box seemed to be watching her, its presence heavy in the room. It was as if the air itself had changed, thick with an unspoken tension. At night, she began hearing faint whispers, soft, almost imperceptible, yet always present. They came from somewhere in the darkness, skittering just beyond the reach of her understanding. The whispers grew louder and more urgent as the days passed, until Lisa could no longer ignore them. They seemed to call her name, a haunting chant that came from nowhere and everywhere all at once. She lay awake in bed, her heart racing, straining to make sense of the sound, but it was always just out of reach. At first, she tried to convince herself it was nothing, just the creaking of the house settling or the wind outside. But soon, the disturbances grew impossible to ignore. Her belongings were no longer where she had left them. Books had shifted on the shelf, a photograph had fallen from its frame, and once she found a mug on the kitchen counter that had never been there. The worst came one evening when she sat down on the couch to read. The room was still and quiet, until the unmistakable sound of the music box began playing again. Lisa's breath hitched as she turned, her eyes locking onto the shelf where it sat. It was closed just as she had left it. Yet the tune echoed in the air, unsettling and melodic, filling the room with an eerie atmosphere that made her skin crawl. Something was wrong. She didn't know how, but she could feel it deep in her bones. The haunting had only just begun. Driven by an unsettling sense of urgency, Lisa decided to uncover the mystery behind the music box. She spent hours searching through online forums and antique collector websites, but nothing seemed to explain its strange behavior. Frustrated, she turned to the local library, hoping to find some historical context for the peculiar object. After hours of digging through dusty old books, she stumbled upon a strange entry in a local history journal. The article detailed the story of a woman named Eleanor Montgomery, a woman from the 1800s who had tragically been buried alive after being wrongfully accused of insanity. The story was chilling. Eleanor's husband, a wealthy but cruel man, had locked her away in a dark, hidden room for years, convinced she was a danger to society. One day, in a fit of rage, he had her buried in the family tomb, believing she had died from a fit of madness. But Eleanor had not died. She was still alive when the tomb door was sealed, her screams unheard. As her final breath left her body, her spirit became bound to an object, a music box that her husband had once given her as a gift. The box was said to contain her soul, and legend told that whoever opened it after midnight would be cursed to suffer Eleanor's wrath. Lisa's heart pounded in her chest as the pieces began to fall into place. The music box she had bought was Eleanor's, the very same cursed object that had claimed countless victims throughout the years. A chill ran down Lisa's spine. The old man's warning echoed in her mind, and she finally realized the terrifying truth. She had brought something into her home far more dangerous than a simple trinket. Lisa could no longer ignore the ominous presence in her home. The whispers grew louder, and the strange occurrences became more frequent. The music box, once an innocuous object, now seemed to hold a dark power over her. She knew what she had to do. There was no turning back. She had to face the curse head-on. That night, Lisa prepared herself for what she feared would be the final encounter. She knew what the legend said. The music box was not a simple trinket. It was a vessel for Eleanor's trapped soul. She had read enough to understand that once opened, it could not be undone. The ghost of Eleanor would be free, and it would come for her. The clock on the wall ticked louder than ever as the hours passed. Lisa sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the music box on the shelf. The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by the steady beat of her heart. She watched as the hands of the clock inched closer to midnight. With every passing second, her anxiety grew, a cold sweat forming on her brow. At exactly 12 o'clock, the faint melody that had haunted her for days began to play. The same eerie, delicate tune that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. Lisa's body tensed as she stood and walked toward the shelf. The music played louder now, its melody filling every corner of the room with a bone-chilling sense of foreboding. Her hands trembled as she reached for the box, the weight of its curse pressing down on her. She could feel the temperature in the room drop, a coldness creeping in from the corners as if the very air was turning against her. The whispers started again, faint at first, then louder, more insistent. "Let me out." Lisa opened the lid of the music box, ignoring the sharp pang of terror that gripped her chest. The moment the lid creaked open, the room plunged into darkness. The melody stopped abruptly, leaving behind a thick, suffocating silence. In the pitch-black room, Lisa heard the faintest sound, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and heavy. Her breath caught in her throat as the air around her seemed to vibrate with an unnatural energy. She turned, her eyes straining to see in the darkness, but nothing was visible. Then, without warning, a voice, low and guttural, whispered in her ear, "You opened it. Now you are mine." Lisa spun around, her heart racing. Before her stood a figure, Eleanor's ghost. The woman's face was a twisted, rotting mask of agony, her eyes hollow and dark. Her hair hung in tangled, matted clumps, and her clothes were torn and stained with dirt. She looked as though she had risen from her grave, her body decayed but still standing before Lisa. Eleanor's mouth moved again, her voice a sickening rasp. "You should have never opened the box." Lisa backed away, her legs weak beneath her, but the spirit advanced, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet whose strings had been pulled too tight. The room seemed to close in around Lisa as the ghost's presence grew stronger, more suffocating. Her body froze as she realized there was no escape. She was trapped just like Eleanor had been. And now she too would become part of the curse. With a sudden, violent jolt, the lights flickered back on. The ghost was gone. The music box lay open on the shelf once again, its eerie tune now silent. But the damage had been done. The curse had taken hold. And Lisa knew that there was no going back. The next morning, Lisa awoke with a start, her body drenched in sweat. Her heart pounded and her breath came in short gasps. For a moment, she thought the events of the previous night had been a dream, an awful nightmare that had simply faded with the morning light. But as she glanced toward the shelf, her stomach sank. The music box sat there, closed exactly where it had been before. She could feel the weight of it as if it were silently mocking her, a reminder that the curse was still very much alive. Had it all been real? Lisa stood up slowly, her mind racing. The ghost, Eleanor, had appeared, her horrifying presence unmistakable. The curse had been unleashed and there was no way to undo what had been done. She ran her fingers through her hair, trying to calm herself, but the sense of dread refused to leave. She reached for the box, her fingers trembling as she lifted it. The wood felt cold, almost lifeless in her hands, and the once beautiful carvings now seemed to warp under her touch. A sudden thought crossed her mind. Maybe, just maybe, if I close it again, if I lock it away. But before she could consider any further, the music box sprang to life on its own, the eerie melody filling the room. No, Lisa whispered, her voice shaking. She hadn't even opened it. Yet the music continued, louder than ever. It was as if the box was determined to carry on, to torment her endlessly. She slammed the lid shut, hoping that would stop it, but the haunting tune continued to play, only now it was different. It was faster, more frantic, as if something was pushing against the very limits of the box. Her mind raced. What was happening? She had opened the box and Eleanor's curse had begun. But why was it still playing? Why hadn't it stopped? A sudden realization hit her, one that chilled her to the bone. The curse was not over. In fact, it had just begun. Eleanor's spirit hadn't been freed. It had simply shifted. And now the cycle was set to continue, not just with Lisa, but with anyone who came across the music box. The whispers started again, faint at first, but growing louder with every passing second. You opened it, now you will suffer. And so will the next. And the next. The voice was Eleanor's, but there was something else now, a deeper, darker presence, as if the curse had taken on a life of its own. The music box was no longer just an object. It was a vessel of something far more terrifying. Lisa's vision blurred as the room around her seemed to spin. Her body went numb and she collapsed onto the floor, the last thing she saw being the music box's lid slowly creaking open once more. The cycle had begun. And this time there would be no escape. Not for Lisa. Not for anyone. The curse would continue forever.